The aircraft reached the departure gate at a busy UK international airport just after sunrise, completing its earlier flight without any reported issues. Passengers disembarked, cabin crew conducted routine checks, and ground staff began the tight turnaround required to keep the morning schedule on time. The flight was planned as a standard short-haul route within Europe and carried no special designation, no VIP passengers, no weather threats, and no delays. The cockpit crew arrived shortly after, reviewed the technical log, and prepared for departure. Among the entries was a small maintenance note from the night shift stating that a brief vibration fluctuation had appeared on one engine during an automated check and then disappeared before it could be replicated. The value stayed within operational limits, no fault codes remained active, and the aircraft had been cleared under existing procedures. The captain read the entry carefully, but found nothing that required further action under regulations. Boarding began. Passengers settled into their seats. Cargo doors were secured and fuel was loaded according to plan. Once boarding was complete, pushback clearance was granted and the aircraft was moved from the gate. Both engines restarted normally. All cockpit indications showed green and taxi clearance was issued. The aircraft joined the departure queue while the crew completed final checklists. Communication with air traffic control was routine and weather conditions were stable with good visibility as the aircraft approached the assigned runway. The captain conducted a final review of engine data, noting that while both engines were operating within limits, one showed a slightly different response pattern during thrust changes. The difference was small and did not violate any parameters, but it was consistent with the earlier maintenance note. Still, no checklist or warning required intervention, and rejecting a flight without clear cause can create its own risks. The aircraft lined up on the runway and received takeoff clearance. Thrust levers were advanced, engines responded, and acceleration began smoothly. Passengers felt the steady pushback into their seats as speed increased. Runway markings passed faster beneath the nose, and cockpit instruments confirmed expected performance. But as the aircraft approached high speed, the captain noticed a subtle delay between commanded thrust and actual engine response on one side. The delay was brief, less than a second, but it repeated once more as power stabilized. No alarms sounded, no system flagged a failure. Yet the asymmetry was now undeniable to an experienced eye. The aircraft was nearing rotation speed, leaving only moments. To decide continuing would place the aircraft airborne with an unresolved engine behavior, while rejecting would require heavy braking at high speed with limited runway remaining. The captain made the decision to abort the takeoff. Thrust was reduced, maximum braking was applied, spoilers deployed automatically, and the aircraft decelerated sharply. Inside the cabin, passengers were startled by the sudden force. Some gasped, others grabbed armrests. But no one understood what had happened. The aircraft slowed rapidly and came to a stop with little runway remaining ahead. Air traffic control cleared the runway immediately. Fire and rescue vehicles were dispatched as a precaution. Smoke began to rise from the landing gear due to brake heat, but no fire developed. The crew instructed passengers to remain seated while systems were assessed. There was no evacuation, no visible panic, just confusion and waiting. Engineers reached the aircraft on the runway and began an inspection. Initial checks showed no obvious external damage. But once diagnostic equipment was connected, the earlier vibration anomaly returned, this time persistent, appearing only under rapid thrust change conditions. Deeper analysis revealed an intermittent failure in the engine's electronic control unit, causing irregular fuel scheduling during acceleration. The fault was rare, inconsistent, and difficult to detect through normal monitoring. Engineers confirmed that under continued climb power, the issue could have worsened, potentially leading to asymmetric thrust shortly after liftoff. The aircraft was towed back to the gate and the flight was officially canceled. Passengers were informed that a technical fault required further inspection and were rebooked on later flights. Most expressed frustration at the delay, unaware that the decision to stop on the runway had likely prevented a far more dangerous situation in the air. The aircraft was removed from service for detailed examination, and the engine manufacturer was notified. Investigators reconstructed the takeoff sequence using recorded data. confirming that no automated system would have required a reject at that moment. The decision rested entirely with the captain's judgment, based on subtle performance cues rather than warnings. Internal airline review classified the rejected takeoff as appropriate and necessary, and the incident was reported to UK aviation authorities as a safety event rather than an accident. Further inspections of similar aircraft identified additional units with early signs of the same failure pattern, leading to targeted replacements across the fleet. Within the airline, the case was shared internally as an example of correct decision-making under uncertainty, not because of dramatic action, but because of attention to detail and refusal to ignore small inconsistencies. The captain returned to duty without public recognition, the passengers moved on, and the airport resumed its normal rhythm. But the event marked a critical point in understanding how easily a routine flight can shift toward danger without warning, and how the outcome can depend entirely on a single decision made within seconds, long before anyone on board realizes how close they came to being airborne with a hidden failure. Imagine sitting on a plane, ready for takeoff, when suddenly the engines roar to life. You're pushed back in your seat, and just as you expect to lift off, the plane brakes hard, throwing you forward. That's exactly what happened on this flight. After the aircraft was towed back to the gate, the mood shifted. This wasn't just a minor delay. Engineers immediately surrounded one of the engines, their inspection far more intense than usual. The flight was officially grounded, and a preservation order was placed on the flight data and cockpit voice recorders. Nothing could be touched. The captain and first officer were taken to a quiet room. Separately, they recounted the takeoff sequence. They described the exact moments, what the instruments showed, and the gut feeling that something was wrong. Both pilots, independently, mentioned a subtle lag in thrust from one engine. This consistency was crucial. Safety managers started digging, pulling up maintenance logs, and listening to the cockpit recordings. They quickly connected the dots between the pilot's report and a curious note from the night shift maintenance crew about a brief engine vibration. The engine manufacturer didn't waste any time. They dispatched their own technical specialists to the airport within hours. The suspicion was an electronic control anomaly, and if they were right, this problem could be affecting other aircraft worldwide. Detailed diagnostic tests began, and what they found was chilling. The engine's electronic control unit, its brain, was intermittently miscalculating fuel flow during rapid power changes, like at takeoff. The scariest part, the fault didn't leave a permanent error code. It would appear and then vanish, resetting itself, making it almost impossible to detect unless you were watching at the exact right moment. Investigators went to the simulators. They reconstructed the rejected takeoff using the flight data. Their findings confirmed the pilot's incredible skill and instinct. The aircraft had reached a speed where it was just seconds away from lifting off the ground. If it had become airborne, the asymmetric thrust could have become much worse during the climb. Imagine a plane at low altitude, heavy with fuel and passengers, with one engine not pulling its weight. Correcting that situation would have been incredibly complex and dangerous. The UK's Aviation Authority was notified and classified it as a significant safety occurrence. This triggered a formal, confidential investigation. They looked at everything: maintenance practices, crew decision-making, and the manufacturer's original design. The night shift engineer who wrote that initial vibration note was interviewed. He admitted that on a normal, busy night, he might not have even logged such a fleeting reading. But because it happened twice in a short period before disappearing, he decided to write it down. That small, seemingly insignificant decision created a paper trail that ultimately validated the captain's choice to abort the takeoff. Investigators later said that without that note, the captain's judgment might have faced intense scrutiny, especially given the huge financial cost of a high-speed rejected takeoff. For days, engineers worked to recreate the fault under controlled conditions. They discovered that the control unit would only fail after a specific sequence of thermal and electrical states aligned. This explained why previous flights had been perfectly normal and why no standard alarms were triggered. The manufacturer had to acknowledge a design flaw. Their system was built to look for persistent faults, not these ghostly, intermittent ones. A narrow but dangerous gap in the safety net. Internal bulletins were immediately sent to all airlines operating that aircraft type. The message was clear: crews needed to be extra vigilant about thrust symmetry during takeoff, even if the computers weren't showing any warnings. Meanwhile, the flight crew was put on routine post-incident rest. This wasn't a punishment, it was standard procedure. After debriefing sessions, they returned to duty. The captain's actions were reviewed by a panel of senior pilots, safety analysts, and regulators. Their conclusion was unanimous: the captain had made the right call. Continuing the takeoff would have introduced far greater risk than stopping. The panel formally endorsed the decision, reinforcing a core principle of aviation: pilots are expected to act on credible doubt, even without a flashing red light, as long as it's within the aircraft's performance limits. The passengers, of course, were largely kept in the dark. They received updates about a technical issue, but never knew how close they came to a potential disaster. Behind the scenes, the investigation expanded. Control units from other aircraft were pulled for inspection. A small number showed early signs of the same degradation, leading to a wave of preventative replacements. The airline itself updated its procedures, encouraging pilots to discuss subtle anomalies more openly during pre-flight briefings. Maintenance rules were also tightened to ensure that transient but repeated issues got the attention they deserved. The final investigation report was anything but dramatic. It was a dry, factual account of the sequence of events, the data, and the decisions made. But its conclusion was powerful. It called the incident a successful interruption of an accident chain. It identified 3 critical moments where disaster was averted. First, the engineer who chose to log the minor vibration. Second, the captain who felt the subtle asymmetry in thrust. And third, the decision to abort the takeoff despite immense operational pressure. None of these actions alone would have been enough, but together, they formed a layered defense that worked perfectly. The aircraft eventually returned to service after extensive repairs and testing, flying thousands of hours without another issue. The flight number was quietly retired as standard practice. The captain continued his career, sometimes sharing the story in confidential training sessions, not for praise, but to teach a vital lesson: paying attention to the small details, the little things that feel slightly off, is what matters most. That's how you catch a problem before it starts screaming at you. This story never made headlines. No passengers were interviewed on TV, and no shaky phone footage went viral. But within the aviation safety community, it became a landmark case. It's a perfect example of how modern accidents are prevented not by dramatic reactions to obvious danger, but by recognizing uncertainty early and acting decisively. As the final review meeting concluded, the investigators all agreed on one thing. Had that aircraft lifted off, the outcome was uncertain, but the risk would have been immense, and the chance to safely stop on the runway would have been gone forever. The story ended not with a crash, but with a stopped plane on a quiet runway and a cancelled flight. From the outside, it looked like an inconvenience. But from the inside, it was the clearest possible definition of success. Thanks for watching. In the weeks following the investigation's closure, the incident quietly faded from operational urgency but remained active in internal safety records. The aircraft returned to scheduled service after replacement of the faulty control unit and completion of multiple test flights, each monitored closely by both airline engineers and manufacturer representatives. No further anomalies appeared, confirming that the fault had been isolated and resolved. The crew involved returned to regular duty, their schedules normalized, and no public statement was ever issued naming the flight or explaining the full sequence of events. Because under aviation reporting standards, the situation had ended before becoming an accident. For passengers, the day remained nothing more than an unexpected delay, a story briefly told to colleagues or family and then forgotten. Yet for those directly involved, particularly the flight crew and maintenance staff, The event carried lasting weight. The captain later described the decision as uncomfortable rather than dramatic, explaining during confidential safety discussions that the absence of alarms made the choice harder, not easier, because rejecting a takeoff without clear system failure invites doubt from every angle, including one's own. The investigation report emphasized that point, noting that modern aircraft are designed to prevent obvious errors but cannot eliminate uncertainty, and that judgment remains a necessary layer of safety when data is incomplete. As a result of the case, the airline introduced subtle but important procedural adjustments, encouraging crews to openly verbalize even minor performance differences during critical phases of flight and reinforcing that no operational pressure should override unresolved technical doubt. Maintenance reporting thresholds were also refined, ensuring that transient but repeated irregularities would receive elevated attention rather than being dismissed as noise. The engine manufacturer issued a service bulletin addressing the control unit failure mode, recommending inspection criteria and replacement intervals that reduce the likelihood of similar events across the fleet. Regulators reviewed the manufacturer's response and accepted the corrective measures, classifying the issue as adequately mitigated internally. The case was archived as a prevention success, an example used during simulator sessions and safety briefings to demonstrate how accident chains are often broken long before danger becomes visible. The story never reached newspapers, never appeared in documentaries, and never generated public debate, yet it fulfilled aviation's highest objective: preventing harm without spectacle. The runway where the aircraft stopped returned to constant use. Aircraft departed and arrived without interruption, and the airport's daily rhythm continued uninterrupted. No physical trace of the event remained, but the lessons persisted quietly in training materials, briefings, and decision-making culture. Years later, the incident would still be referenced in anonymized form, an illustration of how easily a routine flight can approach irreversible risk without crossing any formal warning thresholds, and how the margin for safety can depend on seconds of observation rather than system commands. The final conclusion of the investigation summarized the event in unemotional language, stating that the outcome was determined not by equipment failure alone, but by timely human intervention. The aircraft never became airborne with a compromised system, no emergency evacuation occurred, and no injuries were sustained. From an external perspective, nothing remarkable happened, but from within the safety framework, everything worked as intended. A potential accident was stopped on the ground. The cost was inconvenience, delay, and paperwork, and the benefit was lives never placed at unnecessary risk. This is where the story ends, not with impact fire or headlines, but with a decision